imperative. So, let's begin. Here are the learning objectives of this lesson. What is imperative? When to use imperative? How to build imperative? And finally, some special verbs. So first we need to understand what is imperative. A sentence with imperative gives an advice or an instruction, or expresses a command or a request. Here are a few examples of such sentences in English. Drive carefully would be an advice. Eat your vegetables. Close the door. Please listen to me. These are a few examples in English using imperative. Another thing to remember is that such sentences begin typically with a verb. Also, they end mostly with an exclamation mark. Now let's see how and where to use it. Anwendung. The first and the most common use of imperative is for requests. Bitte. And here's the first sentence. Haben Sie bitte Geduld. As you can observe here, the verb haben is in the first position and the sentence is ending with an exclamation mark. Let's look at another request. Seien Sie bitte leise. Here also the verb is in the first position and the sentence ends with an exclamation mark. Since both the sentences are a request, you would find the word bitte in the sentence. Moving on to the next use. Befehl oder Aufforderung. You would use imperative when you are basically commanding or ordering someone. For example, fahr doch jetzt. In such sentences, you have to be very careful about your intonation. Do remember, it's a command, so it has to sound like a command. The word doch is used in many such sentences. It helps to create an emphasis on the command. Let's look at another sentence. Geh sofort nach Hause. Now let's move on to the next use. Rat. Whenever you have to give an advice, then you use imperative. For example, bitte trinken Sie mehr Wasser. You can also say, trinken Sie bitte mehr Wasser. Here's another example. Mach regelmäßig die Hausaufgabe. You can make this more polite by adding bitte to the sentence. Mach bitte regelmäßig die Hausaufgabe. Great! So these were a few cases where you use imperative. Now let's see how to build imperative. Bildung des Imperativs. Imperativ benutzt man, wenn man eine oder mehrere Personen persönlich direkt anspricht. That means when you're talking to one or more people directly, then you use imperative. Since this form is used only for the second person, we have to remember that imperativ benutzt man nur für du, the plural form of du, that is ihr, and for sie in both singular and plural form. To understand this, let's look at each one of them individually. We begin with du, that is the second person singular form. Zweite Person Singular. It is very important that you have revised verb conjugations before we proceed. You can do that by watching our video on verb conjugation. The link is below in the description. We'll be taking 4 examples. with 4 different verbs. These 4 verbs are conjugated with du. Du gibst, du kommst, du lernst, and du fährst. The imperative form for these verbs are gib, komm, lern, fahr. How do we build imperative? Simple. You remove du and the verb ending st. Du gibst becomes gib. Similarly, du kommst becomes komm. Du lernst becomes lern. Du fährst becomes fahr. Well, in this case, you have to remember that fahren is an irregular verb. It takes the umlaut only when it is conjugated. So this umlaut is also removed while building its imperative form in du. This will happen with all the irregular verbs that take an umlaut when conjugated. If you want to revise irregular verbs, you can watch our video. The link is given below. Now let's look at another set of verbs. Du redest, du sendest, du arbeitest. These forms change to rede, sende, arbeite. For building the imperative of these verbs, you also remove du and the verb ending st. But the e used while conjugating these verbs is not removed. That means the verbs ending with d and t in the Verbstamm take an extra e when making their imperative form. Let's look at another set of verbs. Du machst auf, du hörst zu, du isst, du liest. The first 2 verbs are trennbare Verben. If you want to revise trennbare Verben, you can watch our video on the same. The link is given below. The next 2 verbs are irregular verbs. Let's see how we form the imperative of these verbs. Mach auf, hör zu, iss, lies. As discussed before, while making imperative, we remove du and the ending st from the verbs. In the case of essen and lesen, since they are irregular verbs and their Verbstamm changes in the conjugation, you just remove the t at the end and the du, of course. Hence, du isst changes to is and du liest changes to lies. Let's move on to the plural of du, that is ihr, zweite Person Plural. We will take up 4 examples. Ihr gebt, ihr kommt, ihr lernt, ihr fahrt. While forming imperative for these verbs, you just remove ihr. That means ihr gebt will become gebt. Ihr kommt will become kommt. Ihr lernt will become lernt. And ihr fahrt will become fahrt. Great! Now let's move on to sie. Zweite Person Singular und Plural. This is the easiest form for making imperative. Here again we have 4 examples. Sie geben changes to geben sie. Sie kommen changes to kommen sie. Sie lernen changes to lernen sie. Sie fahren changes to fahren sie. All you have to do is interchange the places of sie and the verb. Don't forget to change the intonation while you're using sentences in imperative. Now we'll be doing some special verbs. Besondere Imperativformen von haben, sein und werden. Since these verbs are special, it's advised to learn the Imperativformen as it is. Let's go through them. The first verb, haben. For du form, you would say hab Geduld. For ihr form, habt Geduld. For sie form, haben Sie Geduld. The next verb is werden. In du form, you would say werde gesund. For ihr form, werdet gesund. In sie form, werden Sie gesund. For both the verbs that we just did, only the du form is different from that of the normal verbs. Let's do the next verb, which is sein. In du form, you would say sei froh. For ihr form, you would say seid froh. For sie form, you would say seien Sie froh. So for the verb sein, the du and the sie forms in imperative are special. Just learn them as it is.